Please, let me go." She was tied in the square for shame, but the cowboy untied her and asked, "Be my wife instead." Dry Hollow, New Mexico Territory, summer afternoon, 1883. The heat hung thick over Dry Hollow like a curse. Dust curled around boots and wagon wheels as townsfolk gathered in the square, sweat glistening on brows, judgment burning in their eyes. At the center of the square stood a wooden post, and tied to it, hands bound above her head, was Nora May, 22, her dark hair matted to her cheeks with blood and heat. Her dress, once pale blue, was torn at the shoulder and crusted with dirt. Her lip was split, one eye swollen, and her bare feet were bleeding from the gravel beneath her. Children watched with wide, gleeful eyes. Women clucked their tongues and shook their heads. Men leaned against porches, arms crossed, chewing tobacco like the scene was no more shocking than a Sunday sermon. A voice rang out from the crowd. "That's what you get for tempting married men, little harlot." A tomato smashed against Nora's side. She flinched, breath catching in her throat. Another voice joined, laughing. Mayor's son said she cornered him behind the chapel, said she begged for it. They threw more. Onions, rotten fruit, a heel of bread. Nora lifted her bruised face, blood drying at the edge of her nose. Her voice cracked as she cried out, "Please, let me go." But no one moved. No one cared. Not one soul asked if she had been forced. Not one considered the bruises as anything more than proof of guilt. She sagged against the post, breathing shallow, heart thudding with shame louder than the jeers. Her gaze blurred. Her knees buckled slightly, but the ropes held her upright, like a spectacle meant to rot in the Sunday. Then, footsteps. Heavy, calm, purposeful. The crowd quieted as the man came into view, tall and broad-shouldered, dust settling on the brim of his dark hat. He wore no badge, spoke no greetings, but as he walked through the crowd, people stepped aside without knowing why. His presence was not loud. It was carved from silence and steel. He stopped 5 feet from the post, looked up at her. Nora opened her eyes. Their eyes met. His were the color of storm clouds, but they held no judgment, just stillness and recognition. He turned to the sheriff standing off to the side, arms folded like a proud executioner. The man spoke, voice even, low, but sharp enough to cut through the square. "Untie her." The sheriff blinked. "Excuse me?" The man took another step forward. "You heard me. Cut her loose." The sheriff sputtered. "Now hold on. She's been sentenced by the town council." The man did not wait. He reached for his knife, not fast, not threatening, but with a certainty that made the townsfolk flinch. He walked straight to the post, turned the blade, and cut through the ropes in one clean stroke. Nora stumbled into his arms, weak and weightless. He held her up with one arm and turned to face the stunned crowd. A murmur rippled. Someone whispered, "That's Charles Boone." Another hissed, "He left town after that shootout years ago. Never thought he'd show his face again." Charles looked down at Nora, then up at the crowd, his voice loud now, not in volume, but in truth. "If you're going to punish her for being alone in this world, then let me stand beside her." He paused. The silence was so thick it swallowed the wind. Then, clear and unwavering, he said, "Be my wife instead." Gasps echoed. Someone dropped a basket, and the square, once roaring with self-righteous fury, stood still as death. Nora, barely conscious, pressed her forehead to his chest and wept, not because she was afraid, but because someone, for the first time, had stepped forward, not to pity her, but to claim her. And the world would never be the same again. The wagon rolled slow through the tall grass, the sound of the wooden wheels softened by earth and wind. The town of Dry Hollow faded behind them like a bad dream swallowed by distance. Before them stretched the open prairie, endless, golden, and quiet. Nora May sat huddled on the bench beside Charles, arms wrapped tightly around her middle, knuckles white against the torn fabric of her dress. Her shoulders curled inward like she was trying to disappear, but her breathing, shallow and uneven, betrayed her pain. The wind tugged gently at her hair, dry and tangled. She did not speak, neither did he. Charles held the reins with one hand, the other resting on his thigh. He kept his eyes on the trail, giving her silence like a gift, not awkward, not cold, just space. As if he understood, she had nothing left to say, and everything left to feel. The sun was beginning to lower when they reached it. His cabin stood alone, nestled between a stretch of low hills and a patch of pines. The wood was weathered but strong, the porch swept clean. A small corral held 2 horses and a sleepy-looking goat. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. Charles climbed down first. He didn't offer his hand, just waited. When she hesitated, he looked up at her, not urging, not impatient. She finally slid down on her own, knees trembling, and followed him up the steps. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and old paper. The floor was swept, a fire crackled in the stove. A clean blanket lay folded on the bed, a chipped mug of water and a plate of biscuits set neatly beside it. There was a faint scent of lemon. A glass of fresh water with a slice floating at the top waited on the table. Nora stood frozen in the doorway, blinking at the space. It was small, but safe. On one wall hung a worn guitar. Beside it, 3 framed photographs, the faces blurred from time and Sunday. A younger Charles stood in one of them, next to a girl, no more than 16, grinning with wild curls and defiant eyes. Charles stepped back, gesturing gently. "You're safe here. Nothing you owe, nothing you need to prove." His voice was steady, kind, but not soft like pity, just human. Nora lowered herself to the edge of the bed like someone expecting to be punished for leaving a mark. She looked up at him, voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" He sat in the wooden chair across the room, arms resting on his knees, his hat still on. He didn't answer right away, just stared into the fire. Then, slowly, "When I was 19, my sister, June, she got pregnant." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. The flame's glow flickered across his face. The town blamed her. Church cast her out. Folks said she was a disgrace. Even the preacher's wife spat on her dress. Nora's lips parted slightly. Her fingers tightened in her lap. "I was supposed to come home that week. She wrote me a letter." He swallowed hard. "Said she didn't want to be a burden anymore." His voice broke for half a second, then returned. "She died the night before I got there. Alone. In the snow." He looked up at Nora then, eyes not pleading, but worn with truth. "If I can save just one, maybe she'll forgive me from wherever she is." Nora's breath hitched. Her hand flew to her chest, pressing against a heart too full and too broken to hold still. She began to cry, not the dry, bitter tears of humiliation, but raw, shaking sobs pulled from some place so deep it had never been touched. She curled into herself, as if afraid to let the pain escape too loudly. But Charles didn't move, didn't stare, didn't try to fix her. He simply stood, turned his back to her, and gave her something she had never been allowed. Privacy, dignity, the space to break and not be blamed for breaking. And through her tears, Nora knew. This man did not see her as something fallen. He saw her as something still standing. The days that followed passed without ceremony. Charles said little and demanded nothing. He did not touch her, did not question her, did not linger in ways that made her skin crawl the way so many men's eyes once had. He moved like someone used to space, his own and others. Every morning he left a basin of warm water near the stove, sometimes a clean cloth, sometimes a biscuit and jam. Other times, just silence, and somehow that was enough. He never asked her to cook, or clean, or speak. But one morning, she folded a blanket that had fallen from his bed. The next, she wiped down the table. By the third, she watered the herbs by the window, lavender, mint, and a shy tomato vine. He noticed, but said nothing. Later, he placed a small pile of linens by the door and muttered, "If you feel up to it, there's a bucket by the creek." Then he walked out. She took the bucket. Inside Charles's mind, there were no grand declarations, no illusions of saviorhood, He did not see himself as a rescuer, only a man trying to make peace with a world that had taken too much and given too little. He believed in small things. A chair that didn't creak after he fixed its leg, a bowl of stew left warming on the stove, a back porch with no expectations. He believed healing came not in promises, but in the ordinary rhythm of staying. Let her stay long enough to breathe, he thought. That's how healing starts. One evening, the sky burned, with the orange hush of dusk. The wind had gone still. The whole prairie held its breath. Nora sat on the steps of the cabin, knees hugged to her chest. Her bruises had faded, but their memory lingered in the set of her shoulders. Charles came out with 2 mugs of weak tea. He handed her one, then sat a few steps away, not close, not far, just enough. She stared ahead for a long time, her voice a ghost when it came. My mother died when I was 8. He said nothing. Church took me in, said I was cursed, that my birth brought her death. Charles stared out toward the far hills, jaw tight. They raised me on prayers and backhands, told me I was born sinful, that my face would tempt the devil. She paused, swallowed. By 16, I stopped praying. The wind rustled the long grass. A hawk cried somewhere above. Men hurt me, she whispered, and no one ever said sorry. They just told me I should have known better. Still, Charles said nothing. Instead, he stood, walked back into the cabin, and returned moments later with a bowl of stew. He set it in front of her, steam curling into the cooling air, and sat beside her, quiet, present. They ate in silence. As the sun dipped lower, gold light spilled across her face, softening the hollowed lines beneath her eyes. She turned slightly, looking at him through lashes still wet. Then, her voice, tight, raw. Why didn't you ask me what they said I did? He turned to face her. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. I don't trust town gossip. He waited, then added, but I trust how you look when no one's watching. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She looked away, quickly, but not before a single tear traced down her cheek. She didn't brush it away. For the first time in years, it wasn't shame that made her cry. It was being seen. Truly seen. The gossip traveled faster than fire through dry brush. By week's end, the whole of Dry Hollow knew. Charles Boone, the quiet, stubborn cowboy who once vanished without warning, had returned and brought her with him. The sinner, the scandal, the girl they tied and shamed in the square. They spoke her name like it was poison, like it might stain their tongues. He's keeping her there, like some wounded stray. He's lost his damn mind. Maybe he's just as dirty as she is. At the general store, the whispers grew teeth. By the time they reached the church steps, they had turned to righteous outrage. And outrage rides fast. They came on horseback, 8 strong, hooves thundering down the prairie trail toward Boone's land. At the front rode Agnes Whitlow, wife of Mayor Whitlow, draped in black lace and fury. Behind her, a pair of deacons, 2 young ranch hands, and the sheriff's cousin. Each face twisted with that same fire, the belief that they, and only they, carried the right to judge. They dismounted just beyond the porch. Dust swirled in their wake. Charles was chopping wood when he heard them. He did not rush, did not reach for his gun. He wiped his brow with the back of his wrist and turned to face them as calm as the open sky. Agnes stepped forward, gloved hands tight around her riding crop. "You're harboring sin, Mr. Boone," she snapped, and in doing so, mocking this town's sense of justice. Charles tilted his head slightly, like he hadn't quite heard her. "You brought all this way just to say that?" She scowled. "I came to give you a choice. Send her away, or we take the matter to court. To God. To anyone who'll listen." Charles didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped off the porch, walked past them all, and toward the field beyond his fence line. There, just beyond a patch of wildflowers, Nora stood barefoot in the grass, watching it all. Her hands trembled at her sides, her face pale. Charles bent down, plucked a single daisy from the field, and walked back to her. He held it out. No words, just that small, impossibly human gesture. She took it with shaking fingers. Then, he turned to the crowd. "If you want peace," he said slowly, voice clear as gunmetal, "you'll leave her be." A pause. His eyes narrowed. "If you want war," he stepped forward, boots grinding the dirt, "you'll find I'm not afraid." The silence cracked like a whip. Agnes sneered. One of the younger men began moving toward the porch, hand resting on his belt. Charles didn't warn him. He didn't shout. He pulled his revolver and fired once, straight into the air. The shot echoed across the plains, scattering birds into the sky. Nora flinched, her breath caught. "That land," Charles said evenly, gun still in hand, "belongs to me." He pointed to the house behind him. "That roof mine." He pointed to Nora, who stood frozen, Daisy still in hand. "And that woman," he holstered the gun with one smooth motion, "she is under both." His voice dropped, low and firm. "That makes her family." For a moment, no one moved. Then Agnes turned her horse with a huff. "You'll regret this," she hissed. But Charles had already turned his back. He walked toward the cabin, slow and steady, and held the door open. Nora stepped inside first, her spine a little straighter, her Daisy still in hand. The door shut, and the prairie wind carried the dust of the retreating mob back into the nothingness they came from. The rhythm of the days began to change. Not because anything grand happened, but because Nora was beginning to belong. Each morning Charles saddled his horse and asked, not ordered, if she wanted to ride. At first she said no. Then maybe. Then yes. He taught her how to sit tall in the saddle, how to guide the reins with patience, not fear, how to trust the animal beneath her. Don't yank, just ask. Like you'd ask a person who's got no reason to obey. She laughed once, just once, when her horse sneezed on her skirt. He turned at the sound like he hadn't heard a woman laugh in years. Maybe he hadn't. Afternoons were filled with quiet work. Charles showed her how to tend to the herbs, comfrey, chamomile, echinacea, how to water their roots without drowning them, how to crush the leaves into salves that soothed burns and bruises. They built a chicken coop together, and though Nora's hands blistered from the hammer, she didn't stop. He offered gloves. She refused. At supper, he told her about his father, a man too proud to bend and too bitter to stay. He taught me how to shoot, but not how to sit still. She told him about the hymn she used to hum as a child, alone in the church storeroom, where they locked her when she cried too loudly. He didn't offer comfort. He just listened, and somehow, that was more. One night, a storm rolled in, black clouds churning like angry oceans above the plains. The rain came fast and hard, pelting the roof with fury. Thunder cracked so loud the walls trembled. Nora stood at the window, arms wrapped around herself. Charles came up behind her and held out something, an old leather coat, frayed at the cuffs, the seams weathered soft from use. "It's too big," he said, voice calm. He gave a small shrug. "Like me, but it keeps you warm." She took it without a word and wrapped it around her like armor. It smelled like smoke and saddle soap, and something faintly familiar. She wore it the rest of the night. A few days later, she stitched something in silence by the hearth. Charles didn't ask what it was. He simply kept sharpening a blade, feeding wood to the fire, whittling a bit of cedar like it might become something useful someday. When she was done, she folded the cloth and placed it quietly by his saddle. It was a handkerchief, pale brown linen, with a single stitched letter in the corner, E. She never said what it stood for. He never asked. But the next morning, as he saddled up for a ride to check the fence line, he tied the handkerchief to the base of the saddle horn. Not around his neck. Not hidden away. Right where anyone could see. Nora saw it. From the porch, with her arms crossed and wind tugging at her sleeves, she watched him mount the horse. He didn't look at her, didn't explain. But he reached down once, briefly, and ran his fingers over the embroidered edge like it meant something holy. She didn't speak. But she felt it, deep in her ribs, the shift. She was no longer a guest, or a pity, or a problem he had chosen to carry. She was something he had chosen to keep. The morning the letter came, the wind had gone still. Charles found it nailed to the gatepost, the seal of the Dry Hollow courthouse pressed deep into red wax. He broke it open without a word. The message was short, signed by the mayor himself. If you do not remove the woman from your property, legal action will follow. Your land is not to harbor sin. He folded the letter once, then twice, and slid it into his coat pocket. Nora saw his face when he stepped inside. She was grinding herbs at the table, the air filled with the scent of sage and pine resin. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Charles didn't answer right away. He poured himself a glass of water, took a long sip, then said, "The town's decided they want to take what's mine. They think if they scare me enough, I'll hand you over." That evening the sound of hooves came up the path, slow, deliberate. A man in a dark coat dismounted, carrying a folder wrapped in oilskin. His hat shadowed his eyes, but his tone was all authority. "Mr. Boone," he said, "I've been sent by the court. There's a matter to settle." He turned slightly toward Nora, who stood in the doorway. "Miss May, if you sign this confession, state that your conduct was improper, the court will drop all charges against him. Refuse, and the property will be seized for harboring indecency." Nora's fingers tightened around the doorframe. The words hung in the air like dust in sunlight. Charles's jaw shifted once, the muscles along his neck tightening. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. "You've said your piece, now I'll ask mine." He looked at Nora, not at the man. "Do you want to stay?" Her eyes widened. The question landed like a stone in her chest. He wasn't deciding for her. He was giving her the choice no one ever had. Her hands trembled as she glanced between them, the court messenger with his cold eyes and Charles, standing calm, unbending, the weight of every consequence already on his shoulders. She began, her throat tight. "If I stay, you could lose everything." Charles didn't blink. "Things can be rebuilt. People can't." Tears burned at the back of her eyes. She took a step forward, her voice shaking but sure. "I'd rather be hated with you than pitied by them." The man frowned, flipping open the document. "Miss May, think carefully. This will be on record. The mayor intends to—" Before he could finish, Nora reached out, snatched the paper from his hand, and looked at the words inked in neat, merciless script. "Confession of immoral conduct." Beneath it, a space for her name. The very idea made her stomach twist. She lifted her chin, the trembling in her hands replaced by something sharper, steadier. "You don't scare me anymore," she said. The man blinked, startled. Nora's voice grew stronger, echoing through the small yard. "I've already survived worse. I've already survived you." And with that, she tore the paper in half. The sound split the quiet like a whip crack, the fragments fluttering to the ground like pale leaves. The courtman backed away, muttering something about consequences, about law and order, but Charles only stepped forward, the faintest glint of pride in his eyes. "You can tell them," he said evenly, "this land still answers to me." When the rider finally left, the sky was streaked with the deep red of approaching dusk. Nora stood beside the porch, chest heaving, hair tangled in the wind. Charles watched her a moment, then said softly, "You did good." She shook her head. "I just got tired of being afraid." He nodded once. "That's where courage starts." The two of them stood there until the light faded, the scraps of torn paper scattered around their boots, a silent testament to the moment fear lost its grip on her for good. The sun was lowering into the hills like it had nowhere else to be. The sky above Dry Hollow was soft with color, amber melting into rose, then into lavender, casting a quiet hush over the land. The only sound was the slow tread of hooves on sun-dried dirt, two silhouettes riding up the ridge that overlooked the prairie. Nora sat tall in her saddle, the wind pulling gently at her braid, her hands calm on the reins. Beside her rode Charles, silent as ever, yet never far. The space between them felt fuller these days. Not crowded, not heavy, just present. At the crest of the hill, they stopped. Below them stretched miles of wild earth, unbroken except for one thin creek glinting like silver in the dying light. Nora drew a long breath and said, "When I was a girl, I used to dream of a place like this." Charles glanced at her but didn't interrupt. She continued, voice steady but soft. There was a field with tall grass and a roof that didn't leak, a warm stove, a name on a gate that didn't come with shame, someone waiting at the door who looked at me like I belonged. She paused, then looked down. That dream went quiet for a long time. Charles dismounted first, boots landing in the dry grass with a soft thud. He walked to the edge of the ridge, hands in his pockets, staring out over the valley. Then, without a word, he turned back and reached inside his coat. In his hand was something small, rough, and dark against his calloused fingers. A ring, not gold, not store-bought. It was made of bent steel, smoothed and coiled, with an inlay of deep-colored wood, mahogany, oiled and shaped by hand. Nora blinked. Charles didn't kneel. He didn't clear his throat. He just stepped forward until they were eye to eye, wind rustling between them like a whisper from the earth itself. "I never asked," he said quietly, "because I didn't want to make you feel owed." Nora's lips parted, but no sound came. He held the ring out. "But I ask now, freely. No debts, no past, just choice." His voice dropped even lower. "Will you be my wife?" For a second, the only thing Nora could hear was the thundering in her chest, then the wind, then the silence inside her, peaceful and still, like a lake undisturbed. She looked at the ring, then at him, the man who had never asked her to be anything but herself, who had handed her bread without asking for gratitude, who had let her cry without turning away, who had stood beside her when the world turned its back. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and helpless, and full of something she hadn't dared to name, until now. She nodded. "Yes," she whispered. Charles exhaled, almost inaudibly, and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit, not perfectly, but honestly. She smiled, really smiled, and the tears slipped down her cheeks, streaking the dust on her skin. Charles brushed a thumb across her cheek but said nothing. They stood together on that ridge as the sun dipped behind the world. The dream she thought she'd buried had found its way back, not in thunder, not in glory, but in stillness. And in a ring shaped by hand, offered by a man who asked and waited. Spring rolled over Dry Hollow like a second chance. The wedding had no chapel, no polished shoes, no hymns from a pulpit. Just a field of wild clover swaying under the breeze, a lone birch tree with bark like silver threads, and two people who had nothing to prove to anyone but each other. Nora stood in a simple linen dress, barefoot in the grass. Around her head, a crown of prairie flowers she had woven herself, daisies, sage blossom, and soft sprigs of yarrow. Charles stood across from her, broad hands clasped in front of him, boots dusty, shirt collar slightly crooked. And yet, in the hush between them, there was reverence. They didn't exchange rings again, only words. Charles looked her in the eyes and said, "I won't promise you a perfect life, but I promise you won't face it alone." Nora nodded, tears held back only by the smile that trembled on her lips. They were married beneath the open sky, the wind as witness and the earth beneath them steady. No lawman, no priest, just love, spoken clearly, chosen freely. Later that week, Charles hung a new sign by hand on the wooden arch that marked the start of their land. He carved each letter with care into the oak plank, sanding the edges smooth before raising it into place. Boone Homestead, Charles, Nora, and Hope. Hope, the name of their daughter, born in the quiet of a snow-covered winter, a girl with her father's steady gaze and her mother's fire. Dry Hollow still whispered, of course, it always would. But the tone had changed. When Nora walked into town now, baby strapped to her chest, people looked, then looked again, softer this time. Some nodded, some lowered their eyes, some even smiled. She was no longer the girl tied to the post. She was a wife, a mother, and now a teacher. Nora opened a schoolhouse in the old canning barn at the edge of the square. Children who once ran barefoot through alleys came each morning, smudged with coal dust and dreams. She taught them letters first, then stories, told them they were more than the names they'd been called, more than the shame handed to them. One afternoon, she stood in front of her students, chalk in hand, her daughter babbling softly from a woven cradle beside the desk. She traced the word believe on the board and said, "This is what they cannot take from you." When class ended, a quiet girl with ink-stained fingers asked Nora to walk her home. The child had thin shoulders and wide eyes, the kind that flinched when doors creaked too loudly. They walked in silence through the town square, golden light slanting across the bricks. And there it stood, the old post, still bolted to the stone, weathered and worn. Nora paused. The girl tugged her sleeve. "Miss Nora, why do you always stop here?" Nora knelt beside her, brushing dust from the girl's cheek. "This is where they tied me," she said softly. Then she smiled. "But it's also where he untied me, and chose me instead." The girl didn't speak, but she reached out and took Nora's hand. Together they turned and walked toward the little barn school, its door propped open, a chalkboard inside half covered in tomorrow's lesson. Above the doorway, carved into a piece of salvaged wood, hung a sign. Hope's Corner. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with fire and forgiveness. And in that golden hour, the town of Dry Hollow watched a woman walk through her past, unbroken, unbent, and leave behind something greater than shame. She left behind a legacy. Thank you for riding all the way to the end of Nora and Charles's story, a tale not just of love, but of standing tall when the world tries to keep you down. If this story stirred your heart, made you tear up or cheer just a little, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable romances born from dust, danger, and devotion. See you on the next ride, partner.